Jesus said something that confuses a lot of people. He said, some will not partake of death until a particular event. And I think most of you already know the verses that I'm talking about here. And we'll dig into that idea. What did Jesus mean by that? So the three gospels, or three of the four gospels, have Jesus speaking this phrase. And we'll get into that phrase in just a moment. And the phrase seems to say that there are some people who are not going to be partaking of death. They're not going to die before they would see something. Now, that something he calls the kingdom of God, but it isn't clear what he means by the kingdom of God. And so that's part of what we'll figure out here. So the actual verse that we're going to focus on is this one, but there's a context to it that we need to get as well. He says, I tell you the truth, there are men who stand here who will not partake of death until they behold the kingdom of God. And that has caused a lot of confusion, as I said, a lot of misunderstandings. And some people think that this means that the second coming happened almost 2,000 years ago within the life of the disciples, and that somehow we've missed it. Or some other people think that that means that some of Jesus' disciples didn't actually die, but they're still here along with us today, still living in society with us, and we just don't know who they are. Or some people think that this means that Jesus really meant to say King of the heaven. He didn't mean kingdom of God, as it says up here. He didn't mean, as he said up here. He doesn't mean that. He means King of heaven. Now that's really changing the words, and so it's you have to have a good reason for that, and they don't have a good reason for that. So and so they say that he means King of heaven, which really means the transfiguration, which happens a little bit later. So all three gospels record the transfiguration coming very soon after, and so it's definitely related here, and we'll see more about that. So there's definitely oddities in there that we've already mentioned. It does seem like Jesus means that the kingdom of heaven is the same thing as the second coming. And so all of the stuff that we expect to happen at the second coming is what we would expect that he's saying some of his disciples would behold, but we know that the second coming involves resurrection and all sorts of establishing his kingdom, and just a large number of events happen. And so it doesn't seem right that he's saying that all of these things are going to happen in the viewing of his disciples, because those things only happened once and they didn't happen then. So that's curious. It does seem also to link, and this whole context does seem to link Jesus' words to the transfiguration. And the best reason for that is to look at what Luke says in his account of what happened. In the verses that follow immediately after the verse that we just read, it says, but it happened after these words that Jesus said, about 8 days later, Yeshua was transfigured. And so it's crystal clear in what's being said here that there is a linkage between the words that Jesus said and his transfiguration, and you can't get around that. That's right there, can't be avoided. But it also does seem strange that Jesus would set this event as something that some people would see in their lifetimes, and so potentially decades long, when it was really going to happen in 8 days, and he knew it was going to happen in 8 days. So why has he said some of you are going to live some period of time, and potentially as long as you might live? Others are going to die, but eventually some of you are going to see this thing. You're going to behold the kingdom of heaven, he says, but in fact it's going to happen in 8 days, 8 days later. So why does it seem that way? And we'll dig into that and understand that better too. So Jesus' meaning, the first thing we're going to do is look at more of the context. And so we're going to look at both verse 26 and 27. So reading it through, it says, whoever will be ashamed of me and of my words, of that one will the Son of Man be ashamed whenever he comes in the glory of his Father with his holy angels. Sounds like the second coming. I tell you the truth, there are men who stand here who will not partake of death until they behold the kingdom of God. So what Jesus does in verse 26 is really important. He's talking about his coming again, and so he's just referred to the second coming, and he says he comes in the glory of his Father. That's critical to understand. If you don't get the idea of what he's saying, when he comes in the glory of his Father with his holy angels, you will miss what he's saying. And so he has said that just before, and so now when he says, behold the kingdom of God, here he is referring back to what he said before, coming in the glory of his Father with his holy angels. And so he's talking about a subset of the events that will happen. He hasn't said there's going to be a resurrection. He doesn't say there's going to be a transformation, all those sort of other things that go along with that. He's only listed these two things, coming in the glory of his Father with his holy angels. Okay, so that sets the context that Jesus is speaking in, and he says, "Behold the kingdom of God." And so, beholding the kingdom of God means he comes in the glory with his he comes in the glory of his Father with his holy angels, and so you must get that. Those two are really tightly linked together, and they you misunderstand them if you don't get that. So that's what he's talking about. So he is referring to the transfiguration event. And the following verse after this one, verse 28 and 29, those two verses, clearly, as I showed you before, link these two events together, what Jesus has said here and the transfiguration that happens 8 days later. Okay, so the phrase, "some of you will not partake of death," confuses people, as I said. Um, the length of the audience's lives, and the audience is at least his disciples, maybe a few other people, but primarily his disciples and maybe only his disciples. The length of the audience's lives isn't his point, isn't Jesus' point at all. And so many people stumble over that and they say, oh, this means that these people are going to live a length of time and then the second coming is going to happen. No, that's not at all what he's saying. He's not saying the second coming will occur before all of these people have died. And that's the most common misunderstanding that people get from that. He is not saying that at all. He is saying that a few people would see Jesus in his Father's glory as he would be at the second coming. Okay, now that's tying all those verses together. So, and we see that in what Jesus says. He says, whenever he comes in the glory of his Father, we mentioned also that he says with his holy angels. And so he said in the glory of his Father is what's going to be happening. And so he's listed two things from the second coming that are going to be happening in the next 8 days. And so I can't say it's certain. He may also be saying there would be angels at the transfiguration. I don't think that any account actually mentions angels being there, but maybe they were. I'm a little less certain about that one, but it would make every bit of sense because of all the things that Jesus could have listed as being part of the coming of the kingdom, the only two things that he mentions is coming in the glory of his Father with his holy angels. And this is linked to the transfiguration, so almost certainly both of those things were part of the transfiguration. So he is implying that the second coming is a long ways off. What he really means here is some of you will partake of death without seeing the coming of the kingdom. And so he's saying that some of you are going to live out your lives, whatever length of time they are, and then you're going to die, and the second coming is going to come at a later time after that. So it's not an imminent event. But there are a lot of people at that time who thought it was an imminent event. It was just a short time from when Jesus went up into heaven, was taken up, and when he was going to be coming again. And the apostles, a couple of apostles had to write about that and say, no, it's not in the way we think of time, it's in the way that Jesus thinks of time, and that's different, and it's going to be a length of time yet. So summarizing all of this, what Jesus has said, he's saying the second coming of Jesus is the coming of the kingdom of God, and that's really important to understand. That he is the kingdom of God. When he gets here the second time, he is going to be the kingdom of God, and the things that he does will instantiate that. All of the resurrection, transformation, all of the setting up of an earthly kingdom, all of those things are part of the kingdom of God that happened by his work after that. But he is the kingdom of God. When he gets here, the earth is his. It's now the kingdom of God, and he is in charge of everything. So the moment he gets here, that's what it will be. And so what we see here in these verses is he's saying at that time he will appear in his transfigured form. So if we're alive at that time to see him arrive, we will see him in the same form that those few disciples saw him when he was transfigured on the mountain. So that's the form he's going to come in. If people are expecting to see him just coming in a white sheet clothing, like he took off. That's not what it's going to be. It's going to be like what the disciples saw at the Transfiguration: bright white light, white clothing, the rest of that. So, so what we know about the kingdom of God from this is that until then, which is still in our time now, the kingdom of God is a spiritual kingdom and will have been a spiritual kingdom until he comes and he is the kingdom of God. The next instantiation of the kingdom of God comes into place, and he is the one who creates all of that and causes it all to happen. And at that time, it goes from being a spiritual kingdom to being a physical kingdom. So that's one thing that's intended in what Jesus is saying. Some disciples saw him in his transfigured form, and that's what his real point was. Some of you are going to see me in the same form that I'm going to be in at the time when I come back. But we also see in the implicit things that are said there is that other disciples died without seeing Jesus in his transfigured form. So there were definitely people who did not see him in his transfigured form and will not see him in his transfigured form with human eyes. So I hope that's made that clearer for you. It's really not a complicated thing that Jesus is saying, but he says it in a way that can easily be misunderstood. And until you look at that verse in the context of the other verses, and especially with Luke's help, Luke's joining those two together, the idea of the second coming that he's talking about and the immediacy of the transfiguration, that really helps to put the pieces together when you see what Luke has said.